Okay, I will start if we're good with that. Also, I've had like some spotty connections with internet, so let me know if I should turn my camera off at some point. Okay, so I'm just gonna start by talking about this motion. I think pretty much, I guess the first thing I just want to talk about is like generally framing for all teams within the round, and then I'll just go into some ideas for the Gov and Op teams. So I think in general, something that would benefit all teams is to think about how like therapy speak like came about. So was it that there was already a focus on like mental health problems and like kind of a lot of knowledge on them, and then these terms like came up, and then the terms were used instead of like greater discussions on like mental health problems, and like was it like after like information was already popularized, or did the usage of these terms kind of just like come up and then people use them offhandedly and then the terms became popularized without a greater understanding? I think it's just like something to generally think about. So like, how did this popularization happen? The reason why that's important is because I think all teams in this debate, when you're, trying to oppose it, are trying to compare what reality would look like kind of absent therapy speak. Like, why are we opposing it? Like, what would we have instead, whatever. And so I think if you're able to, on Gov, for instance, talk about why you might prefer like other types of discussions regarding these issues without just like a header, you want to kind of talk about why that would still be a thing that we have. And I think on Op, similarly, if you want to talk about why therapy speak is like important for different types of like access to information, or why this popularization is important to like popularize discussion on these issues, you need to prove why these terms are so useful to having like other mental health topics being popularized in general. So I think in general, this is something that can be framed by all teams within the round. Okay, I will first just talk through, I guess, the government case. And obviously there are like more ideas than what I say. So this is just kind of like some thoughts I have written down. This is not just from people like in my room, like don't take this personally. Okay, so I guess a few things on Gov. So I think one Gov like line that you can run is just talking about in general, framing out the offline that therapy speak is important for people to have like access to information regarding like mental health problems. So, if op teams want to talk about why therapy speak in the popularization of this, led to a lot of discussions that were good for people, I think on Gov, if you're able to prove that you would still have these discussions, then you kind of like take out that argument, and this would be helpful for you in the round. So I think there are a few ways in which you can do this. I think one is just explaining how the existence of this trend, I think, implies there was a pre-existing kind of discourse around these topics. So the fact that like therapy speak became popularized, or the fact that like, a lot of people say, like offhandedly, like X thing is OCD or whatever, implies to some extent that there was pre-existing knowledge of what OCD was and the usage of it. And then maybe later on, it just kind of got used like offhandedly by various individuals. And so I think you can try and prove on Gov that like the popularization of these issues and general discussion and kind of knowing what problems different people can have is something that pre-existed the usage of these terms. So you can say you oppose then that these labels were then kind of used like offhandedly by various people, and you would preferred the trend to continue like without that, right? So I think you can kind of talk about that. I think secondly, you can try and just explain why people always kind of like to discuss like problems that people have. And why there probably would be some push for people to discuss like issues relating to like therapy absent this terminology, or just like discuss generally like the human body and like healing and stuff. Like for instance, the fact that we have like you have people talking about like self-care with or without the like linking that to labels implies that to some extent society would care about these things regardless. So I think these are kind of things that you can discuss under this like broad umbrella on Gov to give yourself pushback against the offline that like some amount of discussion is important. Okay, I think secondly, you maybe want to even prove why these discussions are better in a world where you don't then tie them always to a label, or when people don't make conclusions off of them. And maybe you can claim that this is because often people associate a label with certain meanings when maybe it can be broader than that. And so if you're able to just generally discuss broad problems that people might face, maybe that allows more people to relate to them or understand them or think about like different kind of, not like solutions, but like different ways to kind of like cater your life to problems that you might face to like make your life a bit better. And so I think maybe you can try and talk about why discussions not tied to label allow for a greater expansion of kind of this discourse and might like help even more people or whatever, or like, you know, make it more accepting for more people. Okay. I think secondly, there is like a lot of chance in this debate to talk about like how people end up, I guess, accessing like help as a result of like therapy speak. Like, did it make it easier for people to do so or not? So I think a lot of Gov teams can probably talk about how, like how the usage of these terms, either one makes people feel as if they understand the problems that they have and therefore can like treat them on their own, or kind of look towards like wrong treatments that are given to them, or like don't look a lot deeper. So like, for instance, if people are just like, if everyone is just kind of like saying that they have like, you know, if people just kind of generically say that they like have depression without maybe instead focusing on like specific symptoms that they feel and trying to like figure out where those specific symptoms stem from, maybe it means that they go about either like treating their life in ways that are not best suited for them. So, you know, people can be depressed for a multitude of reasons, but if you associate them all similarly and kind of go down one treatment path, maybe that's not going to end up helping you. So you can talk about why maybe that this won't be as good and maybe better if generically people just thought about like symptoms as opposed to putting like a conclusion to those symptoms based on like kind of things that they've seen online. I think you can also kind of talk about the ways that therapy speak is popularized on Gov and try to frame why the ways that it happens are generally bad. So like, who is doing this popularization? I think, you know, you can talk about how it's like, maybe this is done by like politicians or celebrities or like people on like influencers or whatever. And there's probably room within the Gov case to talk about how different groups might use this or weaponize it in ways that are bad or just like not be like the best actors to talk about these issues. I think there's also a question of, did therapy speak lead to increase or decreasing the stigmatization of like these types of issues? So I think in general, this might be like a push from op teams. And I think on Gov, you can perhaps try and talk about how the usage of these terms is not necessarily there's not necessarily like a positive association that comes with them just because more people are talking about it. So, op teams might try and claim that as we talk about like depression more and more and like kind of normalize its existence, this destigmatizes it. But it also could be true that things are normalized and still have negative associations with them. So I think on Gov, you can perhaps try and kind of preempt that this does not necessarily solve for like stigma that is associated with it. I think there also might be some Gov material just in terms of why like an increased awareness of a term does not lead to like increased like help for like various people. And so perhaps you can say that when you're just kind of using terms offhandedly and like you're kind of like watering down issues, it doesn't mean that like necessarily this doesn't mean that it's like bad to claim that someone has like, let's say, lower levels of anxiety or whatever. But I think you can say in general that people might take these issues less seriously if they kind of believe that it's like just like a problem everyone says they have, but like doesn't really have or whatever. So maybe you can just try and talk about how like these labels have, even as they become more and more popularized, might decrease the amount that people care about listening to them because it's like oversaturated or whatever. There are probably like other ideas on Gov, but I will just move on to talk about the op for a bit. Okay, so in terms of the op case, I guess there are a few ideas here. So I think one, you kind of also want to be framing who is doing this popularization and why you think it is done in a way that has not been good for people. So you can probably talk about the fact that this has been popularized on like a lot of social media, the fact that the people who discuss therapy speak and like kind of label things are not just like experts or like rich people or famous people, but it's also just like, you know, a lot of people's like friends or classmates or coworkers or whatever. Like it's kind of, I'd say, generally used by a lot of different people of a lot of different like diverse backgrounds, age groups, etc. And so you can just kind of frame that this is kind of the way the popularization has generally developed. And therefore, it kind of opens you up to talking about why maybe it's a good thing to like incorporate different communities in discussing like these issues and how, you know, maybe different people feel symptoms differently, or it affects different people's lives differently depending on like who you are and like, you know, where you're at in life. And so you can probably have some arguments as to why that's good. So I think the second thing on in terms of like framing this round is you can probably talk about the ways that having a label is important and helpful for people. So in spreading this. So Gov can try and claim that discussion on these issues might happen regardless on both sides. So I think on op, you specifically want to try and target why does a label help the discussions that you have. So I think it's probably not true, and you should not let Gov teams get away with claiming that just because we use a label means that we don't have any other discussion on the fact that, you know, people can feel problems differently. So just because there's like a label put on the fact that someone has like ADHD doesn't mean that everyone needs to believe that the way in which you have it are the exact same. So I think on op, you kind of want to try and frame how this popularization has not led to that or doesn't need to lead to that, and rather talk about how maybe a label just makes it a lot easier for people because it's like, you know, they'll like hear it and they'll like be less confused. A lot of people like can feel that there are other people who relate to them, even if they have perhaps like different symptoms. They can be like, we have the same like general overall things associated with us, or like this general overall like neurological like difference that has led to this or whatever. So you can just talk about how like perhaps putting a label on something can help people kind of have like some amount of clarity, or maybe like it makes this like spread of discussion easier because people are a bit less confused. It's like less abstract for them or whatever. It's like maybe easier for people to click onto, especially when they previously haven't heard anything on this topic. Maybe you like hear of a label over and over again, and eventually you like look into it and like see what it means or whatever. So I think just in general, there's like probably a bunch of different ways that you can do this, but you want to try and talk about why specifically like the label has been important for the discussions that you have, and why it maybe has led to like good discussions in general. Yeah, I think second, perhaps proving why people self-diagnosing or self-labeling is is a good thing. So I think a lot of Gov teams will try and claim things such as the usage of therapy speak is bad because you have things such as like misdiagnoses or the fact that like people are, you know, diagnosing problems that aren't really there. And I think there's a lot of room on op to argue that this is good. So, I mean, there are like easier arguments such as the fact that there's like, you know, it is kind of inaccessible for people to get diagnosed. The fact that diagnoses are often done more for like white people or for men, or the fact that you need like money to be able to access doctors to like get tested for a lot of these diagnoses in the first place. The fact that different groups of individuals are less believed and therefore less likely to even have diagnoses looked into implies that to some extent we should give people some amount of power to label their own problems that they face when they are unable to get someone else to label that. And I think there's also generally been a trend of when we put labels on the like problems, that people have, there's generally been like people in the world in general, I think have been, I think, more accepting of the fact that people can self-label as a result of that. And so generally been more like willing to adapt to people, even absent having a medical diagnosis. So you can talk about like why it is good and why the fact that we have this and the fact that the fact that more and more people are like perhaps putting their own label on it has enabled just like society to adapt in ways that are like friendlier towards different individuals, even if this didn't mean, you know, having like diagnosis. Because like I think in general there is perhaps some room to argue on op about this kind of causing a greater realization in society that more people have mental health problems, or generally are like more people are neurodivergent than people previously thought. And so that's kind of why maybe there's more of a push towards like adaptations within society, and you can talk about the benefit there. Yeah, I think probably on off you also can have a discussion on why the spread of terminology and like normalizing different types of problems that people have has led to a more positive outlook on them. So as opposed to seeing them as a problem to people's lives. So if you have like influencers or people who are relatively high profile, kind of talking about a problem they have and like putting like using this same speak as like anyone else, you can relate to these individuals and see like they have X thing associated with them, and like I do too, and here's how they live their life, and like people can give advice to each other. And I think you can argue that like advice given from individual people is not inherently a bad thing, right? Like a lot of people be like, oh, you're not getting the proper advice because you don't have like a therapist or a doctor telling you what to do. But a lot of the ways in which people cope with life are not just like being given medication or having a therapist. Sure, those things can be good, but it could also be like lifestyle changes and recommendations from various people. And you can talk about why maybe this has increased access to those types of recommendations that has helped various individuals. Yeah, I would just note a few like probably challenges in the op case that you want to make sure that you overcome. So like, for instance, I think it can be easy to just say that when a term is popularized and you have information spreading, it's necessarily good information. So you kind of want to explain, not just like assert that this is true, but rather do more work to explain why this popularization and the information that we get is good, like fill in those gaps. And what was I gonna say? Yeah, I feel like my last thoughts are just like in general trying to respond to Gov on the op case, like explaining why it is not necessarily a bad thing that we like perhaps like diminish, like not diminish or undermine, but like that we kind of broaden the definition of what different like mental health problems can include. So you can argue that it's maybe perhaps it is a good thing that we see more people falling under this category, even if they have like different types of symptoms, or even if symptoms are less severe, it is still important that we recognize them, or tell people that is important for them to recognize it, because like their life can still be improved or whatever. Okay. I feel like these are like most of my thoughts. I don't know, I can't like see the live stream, so if there are questions, they could be relayed to me, but if not, I don't know if I need to say more. Okay, so are we good? Okay, well, thanks everyone. Bye.